Because understanding great literature is better than trying to read and understand yet another business book. On the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast, we commit to reading, dissecting, and analyzing the great books of the Western canon. You know, those books, from Jane Austen to Shakespeare, and everything else in between, that you might have fallen asleep trying to read in high school. We do this for our listeners, the owner, the entrepreneur, the manager, or the civic leader who doesn't have the time to read, dissect, analyze, and leverage insights from literature to execute leadership best practices in the confusing and chaotic postmodern world we all now inhabit. Welcome to the rescuing of Western civilization at the intersection of literature and leadership. Welcome to the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast. Hello. My name is Hassan Sorrells, and this is the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast, episode number 81. With our book today, a piece of literature that pairs or dovetails nicely with our conversation in episode number 79 with Tom Libby around Dee Brown's book, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, a fictionalization of the truth of the French-Indian War on the North American continent, itself an outgrowth of the 7 Years' War in Europe. Today, we will cover The Last of the Mohicans, a narrative of 1757 by James Fenimore Cooper. Leaders, take action and go to the end of the earth, not only for love, but for duty. And we turn to The Last of the Mohicans. I am reading today the Pocket Books version of this book, published in 1985 by Simon & Schuster Incorporated. Of course, all rights reserved to them. The book overall is copyright 1957 by Simon & Schuster, and the version I have has a picture of Hawkeye on the cover from the 1992 20th Century Fox movie starring Daniel Day-Lewis. And we'll get all into all of that today. So picking up from chapter 1 in our book, The Last of the Mohicans. It was a feature peculiar to the colonial wars of North America that the toils and dangers of the wilderness were to be encountered before the adverse hosts could meet. A wide and apparently an impervious boundary of forests severed the possessions of the hostile provinces of France and England. The hardy colonialist and the trained Europeans who fought at his side frequently expended months in struggling against the rapids of the streams or in effecting the rugged passes of the mountains in quest of an opportunity to exhibit their courage in a more martial conflict. But emulating the patience and self-denial of the practiced native warriors, they learned to overcome every difficulty. And it would seem that, in time, there was no recess of the woods so dark nor any secret place so lovely that it might claim exemption from the inroads of those who had pledged their blood to satiate their vengeance or to uphold the cold and selfish policy of the distant monarchs of Europe. Perhaps no district throughout the whole wide extent of the intermediate frontiers can furnish a livelier picture of the cruelty and fierceness of the savage warfare of those periods than the country which lies between the headwaters of the Hudson and the adjacent lakes. The facilities which nature had there offered to the march of the combatants were too obvious to be neglected. The lengthened sheet of the Champlain stretched from the frontiers of Canada deep within the borders of the neighboring province of New York, forming a natural passage across half the distance that the French were compelled to master in order to strike their enemies. Near its southern termination, it received the contributions of another lake whose waters were so limpid as to have been exclusively selected by the Jesuit missionaries to perform the typical purification of baptism and to obtain for it the title of Lake du Saint-Sacrement, The less zealous English thought they conferred a sufficient honor on its unsullied fountains when they bestowed the name of their reigning prince, the second of the House of Hanover. The two united to rob the untutored possessors of its wooded scenery of their native right to perpetuate its original appellation of Horican. Winding its way among countless islands and embedded in the mountains, the Holy Lake extended a dozen leagues still farther to the south, with the high plain that there interposed itself to the future passage of the water commenced a portage of as many miles, which conducted the adventurer to the banks of the Hudson, at a point where, with the usual obstructions of the rapids, or rifts, as they were then termed in the language of the country, the river became navigable to the tide. While in the pursuit of their daring plans of annoyance, the restless enterprise of the French attempted the distant and difficult gorges of the Allegheny, it may easily be imagined that their proverbial acuteness would not overlook the natural advantages of the district we have just described. It became emphatically the bloody arena in which most of the battles for the mastery of the colonies were contested. Forts were erected at different points that commanded the facilities of the route and were taken and retaken, razed and rebuilt as victory alighted in the hostile banners. While the husbandmen shrank back from the dangerous passages within the safer boundaries of the more ancient settlements, armies larger than those that had often disposed of the scepters of the mother countries were seen to bury themselves in these forests, whence they rarely returned but in skeleton bands that were haggard with care or dejected by defeat. Though the arts of peace were unknown to this fatal region, its forests were alive with men. Its shades and glens rang with the sounds of martial music, and the echoes of its mountains threw back the laugh or repeated the wanton cry of many a gallant and reckless youth as he hurried by them in the noontide of his spirits to slumber in a long night of forgetfulness. It was in this scene of strife and bloodshed that the incidents we shall attempt to relate occurred during the third year of the war with England and France, last waged for the possession of a country that neither was destined to retain. The imbecility of her military leaders abroad and the fatal want of energy in her councils at home had lowered the character of Great Britain from the proud elevation on which it had been placed by the talents and enterprise of her former warriors and statesmen. No longer dreaded by her enemies, her servants were fast losing the confidence of self-respect. In this mortifying abasement, the colonists, though innocent of her imbecility, and too humble to be agents of her blunders, were but the natural precipitators. James Fenimore Cooper, born September 15th, 1789, and died September 14th, 1851, wrote historically based epic romances depicting colonial and indigenous characters. And actually, for the time in which he wrote, James Fenimore Cooper wrote them quite sympathetically, as we will see today or hear today on the podcast. Now, his best-known works are the 5 historical novels of the frontier period, written between 1823 and 1841, known as the Leatherstocking Tales, which introduced the iconic American frontier scout Natty Bumppo, and Last of the Mohicans, a narrative of 1757, sits in the middle of the Leatherstocking Tales. Now, many people don't read these books anymore, and it's really too bad. We kind of think we're a little bit too sophisticated for Cooper's work. But the thing is, Cooper's work was about as sympathetic and about as empathetic as a man of his time and of his literary talents and, quite frankly, of his Christianity could be in the 18th and 19th century. And he wrote about the Indians. He wrote about the indigenous tribes. He wrote about African Americans and women in a very robust and human way for his time. Throughout his career, Cooper published numerous social, political, and historical works of fiction and nonfiction with the objective of countering European prejudices and nurturing an original American art and culture. Now, it's very important to remember as you hear us read from The Last of the Mohicans today, or if you go back and listen to the episode that we did on Nathaniel Hawthorne and the Scarlet Letter, or if you go and listen to the episode that we recently recorded on Moby Dick, written by Herman Melville, that during the period between the end of the American Revolution and the beginning of the American Civil War, writers and artists in America were laboring under the yoke of trying to come out from underneath, trying to counter a vast European culture that was seeking to export itself to America. This was the new world. This was a new place, right? Remember that in episode number 79, in Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, I talked about how the Europeans, when they initially came to the New World, believed fundamentally in their souls that this was a new geography with a new opportunity, and that presented new opportunities to avoid old human foibles. Now, of course, we know that we carry our human foibles everywhere, but this was a genuine belief that, of course, manifested itself in Manifest Destiny and a number of other different places, and, of course, culminated in the Indian Wars of the latter half of the 19th century, and, of course, really began to kick off, or began to get consolidated, I should say, with the Civil War. Well, Cooper and Hawthorne and Melville were part of the movement that was called Romanticism. And like I said, Cooper was part of that movement, but so was Edgar Allan Poe, Horace Walpole, and Lawrence Sterne, he of Tristram Shandy fame. Now, The Last of the Mohicans was Cooper's great masterpiece, and it is still referenced today in popular conversation and in literature. As a matter of fact, the volume that I have, that again was published or reissued in the 1980s, was reissued with a new cover featuring Daniel Day-Lewis as Hawkeye on the cover. That movie was directed by the great director, Michael Mann, and as you know, if you've been listening to the podcast, when I talk to Tom Libby, or any other one of our guests here on the podcast, you know that I'm a big fan of film. I'm a huge film guy, and The Last of the Mohicans is a beautifully shot film. If you don't want to read the book, I would strongly recommend going and seeing that movie. It came out in 1992, and it still stands up today. Now, when we think about James Fenimore Cooper, we of course cannot forget his Christianity. He was a practicing Christian, and he was embedded in a culture that believed the Christianization of the indigenous tribes was one of the more important things that could happen, one of the more important missions, not only of colonialism, but was one of the more important missions of just being a human being. The Great Commission that was given by Jesus in the book of Matthew was really taken seriously by people who had, and people who were the sons and daughters, and in some cases the grandsons and granddaughters, like in the case of James Fenimore Cooper, of the original colonists on the Mayflower, who came to America not to seek a new soul, not really even to seek new geography, but to seek a place where they could worship and evangelize in peace. Back to the book, back to The Last of the Mohicans. We're going to pick up in chapter 5. The suddenness of the flight of his guide and the wild cries of the pursuers caused Haywood to remain fixed for a few moments in inactive surprise. Then, recollecting the importance of securing the fugitive, he dashed aside the surrounding brushes and pressed eagerly forward to lend his aid to the chase. Before he had, however, proceeded 100 yards, he met the 3 foresters already returning from their unsuccessful pursuit. "Why so soon disheartened?" he exclaimed. "The scoundrel must be concealed behind some of these trees, and may yet be secured. We are not safe while he goes at large." "Would you set a cloud to chase the wind?" returned the disappointed scout. "I heard the imp brushing over the dry leaves like a black snake and blinking a glimpse of him just over again in yon big pine. I pulled as it might be on the scent, but 'twouldn't do. And yet, for a reasoning game, if anybody but myself had touched the trigger, I should call it a quick sight, and I might be accounted to have experience in these matters, and one who ought to know. Look at this sumac. Its leaves are red, though everybody knows the fruit is in the yellow blossoms in the month of July. 'Tis the blood of Le Sabatil. He is hurt, and may yet fall." No, returned the scout in deciding disapprobation of his opinion. "I rubbed the bark off a limb, perhaps, but the creature leaped the longer for it. A rifle bullet acts on a running animal when it barks him, much the same as one of your spurs on a horse. That is, it quickens the motion and puts life into the flesh instead of taking it away. But when it cuts the ragged hole after a bound or two, there is commonly a stagnation of further leaping, be it Indian or be it deer. We are 4 able bodies to 1 wounded man." "Is life grievous to you?" interrupted the scout. "Yonder red devil would draw you within the swing of the tomahawks of his comrades before you were heated in the chase. It was an unthoughtful act in a man who has so often slept with the war whoop ringing in the air to let off his piece within sound of an ambushment. But then it was a natural temptation. 'Twas very natural. Come, friends, let us move our station, and in such a fashion, too, as will throw the cunning of a Mingo on a wrong scent, or our scalps will be drying in the wind in front of Montcalm's marquee again this hour tomorrow." This appalling declaration, which the scout uttered with the cool assurance of a man who fully comprehended, while he did not fear to face the danger, served to remind Heywood of the importance of the charge with which he himself had been entrusted. Glancing his eyes around with a vain effort to pierce the gloom that was thickening beneath the leafy arches of the forest, he felt as if, cut off from human aid, his unresisting companions would soon lie at the entire mercy of those barbarous enemies who, like beasts of prey, only waited till the gathering darkness might render their blows more fatally certain. His awakened imagination, diluted by the deceptive light, converted each waving bush or the fragment of some fallen tree into human forms, and 20 times he fancied he could distinguish the horrid visages of his lurking foes peering from their hiding places in never-ceasing watchfulness of the movements of his party. Looking upward, he found that the thin, fleecy clouds which evening had painted on the blue sky were already losing their faintest tints of rose color, while the embedded stream which glided past the spot where he stood was to be traced only by the dark boundary of its wooded banks. "What is to be done?" he said, feeling the utter helplessness of doubt in such a pressing strait. "Desert me not, for God's sakes. Remain to defend those I escort, and freely name your own reward." His companions, who conversed apart in a language of their tribe, heeded not this sudden and earnest appeal. Though their dialogue was maintained in low and cautious sounds, but a little above a whisper, Heywood, who now approached, could easily distinguish the earnest tones of the younger warrior from the more deliberate speeches of his seniors. It was evident that they debated on the propriety of some measures that nearly concerned the welfare of the travelers. Yielding to his powerful interest in the subject and impatient of a delay that seemed fraught with so much additional danger, Heywood drew still nigher to the dusky group with an intention of making his offers of compensation more definite, when the white man, motioning with his hand as if he conceded the disputed point, turned away, saying in a sort of soliloquy and in the English tongue, "Uncas is right. It would not be the act of men to leave such harmless things to their fate, even though it breaks up the harboring place forever. If you would save these tender blossoms from the fangs of the worst of serpents, gentlemen, you have neither the time to lose nor resolution to throw away. How could such a wish be doubted? Have I not already offer your prayers to him who can give us wisdom to circumvent the cunning of the devils who fill these woods?" calmly interrupted the scout. "But spare your offers of money, which neither you may live to realize nor I to profit by. These Mohicans and I will do what man's thoughts can invent to keep such flowers, which, though so sweet, were never made up for the wilderness, from harm, and that without hope of any other recompense, but such as God always gives to upright dealings. First, you must promise 2 things, both in your own name and for your friends, or without serving you, we shall only injure ourselves. Name them. The one is to be still as these sleeping woods. Let what will happen, happen. and the other is to keep the place where we shall take you forever a secret from all mortal men. I will do my utmost to see both these conditions fulfilled. Then follow, for we are losing moments that are as precious as the heart's blood to a stricken deer. Hayward could distinguish the impatient gesture of the scout through the increasing shadows of the evening, and he moved in his footsteps swiftly towards the place where he had left the remainder of his party. When they rejoined the expecting and anxious females, he briefly acquainted them with the conditions of their new guide and with the necessity that existed for their hushing every apprehension in instant and serious exertions. Although his alarming communication was not received without much secret terror by the listeners, his earnest and impressive manner, aided perhaps by the nature of the danger, succeeded in bracing their nerves to undergo some unlooked-for and unusual trial. Silently and without a moment's delay, they permitted him to assist them from their saddles. When they descended quickly to the water's edge, where the scout had collected the rest of the party, more by the agency of expressive gestures than by any use of words. "What to do with these dumb creatures," muttered the white man, on whom the sole control of their future movements appeared to devolve. "It would be time lost to cut their throats and cast them into the river, and to leave them here would be to tell the Mingoes that they have not far to seek to find their owners." It began with Christopher Columbus, who gave the people the name Indios. Those Europeans, the white men, spoke in different dialects, and some pronounced the word Indienne or Indianer or Indienne. Peau Rouge or Redskins came later. As was the custom of the people when receiving strangers, the Taínos on the island of San Salvador generously presented Columbus and his men with gifts and treated them with honor. "So tractable, so peaceable are these people," Christopher Columbus wrote to the King and Queen of Spain, "that I swear to your majesties there is not in the world a better nation. They love their neighbors as themselves, and their discourse is ever sweet and gentle, and accompanied with a smile. And though it is true that they are naked, yet their manners are decorous and praiseworthy." All this, of course, was taken as a sign of weakness, if not heathenism, and Columbus, being a righteous European, was convinced the people should be made to work, sow, and do whatever is necessary, and to adopt our ways. Over the next 4 centuries, 1492 to 1890, several million Europeans and their descendants undertook to enforce their ways upon the people of the New World. That is the opening of Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, An Indian History of the American West by D. Brown, which again we read in episode number 79. And in reading The Last of the Mohicans, written in 1757, approaching, close to 200 years, or a little over 200 years, not approaching, a little over 200 years of continental warfare and colonialism, a fictionalized version of the French and Indian War. What you see when you read The Last of the Mohicans is you see just how well adapted the European settlers, now in their 3rd or 4th, more than that, in their 5th or 6th generation of being on this continent, you see how well adapted they were to Indian ways. So well adapted that Hawkeye could afford to go native. The future of the battles between the Europeans and the indigenous tribal peoples of the New World, the futures that would play out in the American West after the Civil War, the seeds of them you can see beginning to be planted here in James Fenimore Cooper's Last of the Mohicans. Now, I want to speak a little bit about the villain character in The Last of the Mohicans, Magua. Magua feared the extinction of his race at the hands of the whites, and he savagely betrayed them. As a matter of fact, in the opening of The Last of the Mohicans, when we meet him, he is the scout that is guiding Hayward's party with Cora and Alice and Duncan and numerous, a whole ragged train full of people through the woods, and he's guiding them into a trap. Because, see, Magua understood something that Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull and Tecumseh before him, he understood something that the native peoples in the 1880s and the 1890s were going to have to remember. He understood that the only way sometimes you can beat the colonialists at their game is by deceiving them at their game. One of the things you'll note about The Last of the Mohicans is that in the book, the Indians, the native tribes, the Huron, and other members of the Iroquois nation use rifles, and they use them with deadly accuracy, and they use them alongside tomahawks and knives and axes to do their killing. Now, Cooper, in this way, is careful to make the natives seem romantic and otherworldly, while also holding up their ways as being either barbarous or admirable. And he does this all through a Christian lens. I would assert a different Christian lens, a Protestant Christian lens, than Christopher Columbus's Catholic Christian lens. But I'm not relying on postmodern ears to understand that distinction with the difference. At the time when Cooper wrote Last of the Mohicans, his attempts to appeal to the audience, he was trying to get to an audience that might never have met an Indigenous person. And he was also attempting to work through the negative impacts, which were already starting to be seen in the middle part, or the early to middle part of the 19th century. He was attempting to work through the negative impacts of colonialism, not only on the environment. The ringing of axes throughout the Northeast had cleared space for towns that would eventually become cities like Boston, New York City, and Philadelphia, but it had also begun to radically change the natural world in ways that the Iroquois did not understand. As I mentioned before, Cooper is one of the early major American novelists whose books include African American, and Native American characters. He was attempting to show an early version of the American quote-unquote melting pot, which is a concept, of course, that we have lost in our postmodern time, where all we talk about is our separations rather than what we commonly hold together. And just like Hawthorne, sometimes critics struggle, particularly postmodern critics, struggle with James Fenimore Cooper's writing. They struggle with The Last of the Mohicans because it's easy to engage in the oppression Olympics. It's easy to judge James Fenimore Cooper by our time and by our morals, and to find him wanting and then to merely dismiss him. And modern postmodern critics can also do this with, and have also done this with, Herman Melville and with the writings of Nathaniel Hawthorne and Edgar Allan Poe. However, I take the minority report on this because Cooper, just like Hawthorne during his time, is misinterpreted in the present day. And modern readers miss the fact that Cooper was actually critiquing his own time in his own words by that era's own terms. And so if we're going to critique him, we need to critique him not through a 21st century lens, but we need to critique him through a 19th century lens. Almost nobody reads James Fenimore Cooper anymore, while The Last of the Mohicans has entered into the cultural zeitgeist mostly because of the Michael Mann film that I mentioned a couple times now. The actual reading of the Leatherstocking Tales, has tailed off. And that's probably because a guy like Cooper can't be rehabilitated. Because in reality, there's actually nothing about Cooper's writing to fix. Back to the book, back to The Last of the Mohicans. We're going to pick up in chapter 6. Hayward and his female companions witnessed this mysterious movement with secret uneasiness, for though the conduct of the white man had hitherto been above reproach, his rude equipments, blunt address, and strong antipathies, together with the character of his silent associates, were all causes for exciting distrust in minds that had so recently alarmed by Indian treachery. The stranger alone disregarded the passing incidents. He seated himself on a projection of the rocks, whence he gave no other signs of consciousness than by the struggles of his spirit, as manifested frequent and heavy sighs. Smothered voices were heard next, as though men called to each other in the bowels of the earth, when a sudden light flashed upon those without, and laid bare the much-prized secret of the place. At the farther extremity of a narrow, deep cavern in the rock, whose length appeared much extended by the perspective and the nature of the light by which it was seen, was seated the scout, holding a blazing knot of pine. The strong glare of the fire fell full upon his sturdy, weather-beaten countenance and forest attire, lending an air of romantic wildness to the aspect of an individual who, seen by the sober light of day, would have exhibited the peculiarities of a man remarkable for the strangeness of his dress. The iron-like inflexibility of his frame, and the singular compound of quick, vigilant sagacity and of exquisite simplicity that by turns usurped the possession of his muscular features. At a little distance in advance stood Uncas, his whole person thrown powerfully into view. The travelers anxiously regarded the upright, flexible figure of the young Mohican, graceful and unrestrained in the attitudes and movements of nature. Though his person was more than usually screened by a green and fringed hunting shirt like that of the white man, there was no concealment to his dark, glancing, fearless eyes, alike terrible and calm, the bold outline of his high, haughty features, pure in their native red, or to the dignified elevation of his receding forehead, together with all the finest proportions of a noble head, bare to the generous scalping tuft. It was the first opportunity possessed by Duncan and his companions to view the marked lineaments of either their Indian attendants, and each individual of the party felt relieved from the burden of doubt, as the proud and determined, though wild expression of the features of the young warrior forced itself on their notice. They felt it might be a being partially benighted in the veil of ignorance, but it could not be one who would willingly devote his rich natural gifts to the purposes of wanton treachery. The ingenuous Alice gazed at his free air and proud carriage, as she would have looked upon some precious relic of the Grecian chisel, to which life had been imparted by the intervention of a miracle, while Hayward, though accustomed to see the perfection of form which abounds among the uncorrupted natives, openly expressed his admiration at such an unblemished specimen of the noblest proportions of man. "I could sleep in peace," whispered Alice in reply, "with such a fearless and generous-looking youth for my sentinel. Surely, Duncan, those cruel murderers, those terrific scenes of torture of which we read and hear so much, are never acted in the presence of such as he." "This certainly is a rare and brilliant instance of those natural qualities in which those peculiar people are said to excel," he answered. "I agree with you, Alice, in thinking that such a front and eye were formed rather to intimidate than to deceive, but let us not practice a deception upon ourselves by expecting any other exhibition of what we esteem virtue than according to the fashion of a savage. As bright examples of great qualities are but too uncommon among Christians, so are they singular and solitary with the Indians, though, for the honor of our common nature, neither are incapable of producing them. Let us hope that this Mohican may not disappoint our wishes, but prove, what his looks assert him to be, a brave and constant friend." "Now Major Hayward speaks as Major Hayward should," said Cora. "Who that looks at this creature of nature remembers the shade of his skin?" In short, and apparently an embarrassed silence succeeded this remark, which was interrupted by the scout calling to them aloud to enter. "This fire begins to show too bright a flame," he continued as they complied, "and might light the Mingoes to our undoing. Uncas, drop the blanket and show the knaves its dark side. This is not such a supper as a major of the Royal Americans has a right to expect, but I've known stout detachments of corps glad to eat their venison raw, and without a relish, too. Here, you see, we have plenty of salt, and can make a quick broil. There's a fresh sassafras boughs for the ladies to sit on, which may not be as proud as their Mahogany chairs, but which sends up a sweeter flavor than the skin of any hog can do, be it of Guinea or be it of any other land. Come, friend, don't be mournful for the colt. 'Twas an innocent thing, and had not seen much hardship. Its death will save the creatures many a sore back and weary foot." Uncas did as the other had directed, and when the voice of Hawkeye ceased, the roar of the cataract sounded like the rumbling of a distant thunder. "Are we quite safe in this cavern?" demanded Hayward. "Is there no danger of surprise? A single-armed man at its entrance would hold us at his mercy." A spectral-looking figure stalked out from the darkness behind the scout, and seizing a blazing brand, held it towards the farther extremity of their place of retreat. Alice uttered a shriek, and even Cora rose to her feet as this appalling object moved into the light, but a single word from Hayward calmed them, with the reassurance that it was only their attendant, Chingachgook, who, lifting another blanket, discovered that the cavern had 2 outlets. Then, holding the brand, he crossed a deep, narrow chasm in the rocks, which ran at right angles with the passage they were in, but which, unlike that, was open to the heavens, and entered another cave, answering to the description of the first in every essential particular. "Such old foxes as Chingachgook and myself are not often caught in a burrow with one hole," said Hawkeye, laughing. "You can easily see the cunning of the place. The rock is black limestone, which everybody knows is soft. It makes no uncomfortable pillow where brush and pine wood is scarce. Well, the fall was once a few yards below us, and I dare to say it was, in its time, as regular and as handsome a sheet of water as any along the Hudson. But old age is a great injury to good looks, as these sweet young ladies have yet to learn. The place is sadly changed. These rocks are full of cracks, and in some places they are softer than at others some, and the water has worked out deep hollows for itself, until it was fallen back, some 100 feet, breaking here and wearing there, until the falls have neither shape nor consistency." Leading people by fighting nature, and fighting the people who know the landscape the best, and by fighting the people who are intimated to the land. If you're going to engage in a fight like that, if you're going to engage in that sort of warfare, whether it's via geography or demography or ideology, you're going to need the assistance of a fixer. You're going to need a person on the ground. You're going to need a Hawkeye. You're going to need a scout. You're going to need someone like Natty Bumppo. Now, originally, this character was constructed as a way by Fenimore Cooper to demonstrate not only leadership, but to also demonstrate how best white people, Caucasians, European colonists, however you want to frame it, how best they could engage with the native tribes. It was also designed, or he was also designed as a character to create sympathy and to create a bridge of connection. This begins in The Last of the Mohicans. And through Hawkeye, through the scout's eyes, we get a more sympathetic view of the indigenous tribes, but we also get a view that unites the tribes to us as readers, and it makes it more romantic. Now, Daniel Day-Lewis played the Hawkeye scout character in the Michael Mann film, the Michael Mann version of The Last of the Mohicans, and he's not so much interested in helping his companions as he is interested in advancing a warrior narrative of honorable combat against the Iroquois and against the Huron, both of whom are tribes that are in battle. They are in conflict with Chingachgook and with Uncas and with him. Now, speaking of Chingachgook, this is a character who is fleshed out quite a bit in the book and is situated as the wise elder, the voice of wisdom, but it is a voice that only Hawkeye, only the scout, can hear. Now, his son Uncas, however, as was in that description from that last piece we read, is going to be pursued and is going to be tempted to going into the new world, tempted to going into something that is unfamiliar, a place where Chingachgook cannot go, but where Hawkeye has come from. In our degraded time, we struggle to understand the warrior narrative of honorable combat, and we struggle to see the value through our postmodern eyes of what the scout is pursuing. When Sebastian Junger writes his books about men, particularly young men who go off to war, not necessarily immediately seeking glory, but instead seeking meaning, we scratch our heads and we wonder why they can't just get meaning working a regular job or hanging out online. Leaders, this is something to pay attention to, because where people get meaning from, whether it's love or honor, but in particular, if it's honor, this is not necessarily a tool, but a way in to understand their mindset, to understand how they value things. As a matter of fact, when Hayward tries to bribe Hawkeye, Hawkeye tells him, and we read this again in the clip, put your gold away. It doesn't really work here. Hawkeye has something that cannot be bought off with gold and silver and jewels. He knows enough about the European colonialists to know, even in the middle of the French and Indian War, that he's not going to sell his soul for some trinkets. This is not anything that's just unusual to the French and Indian War. So one of the challenges of the wars that America fought in, from Korea all the way to the Second Iraq War in the early 21st century, one of the challenges that was inside of those wars, particularly Vietnam and Iraq, was that we didn't know anybody in country. The culture was foreign to us, and the patterns of behavior were weird and strange to our eyes. Well, the way around that, of course, to align yourself as the invader or as the would-be conqueror with a Hawkeye, with a scout. Get a person on the ground, get a fixer that you could use, partially for your own reasons, to go in and conquer, to go in and exploit, or maybe just to go in and to neutralize a threat, but also realize that that fixer, that in-country person, that scout, that Hawkeye, a most apt name if you think about it, that person might be using you to accomplish his goals as well. Back to the book, back to The Last of the Mohicans, Chapter 8. The warning call of the scout was not uttered without occasion. During the occurrence of the deadly encounter just related, the roar of the falls was unbroken by any human sound whatever. It would seem that interest in the result had kept the natives on the opposite shores in breathless suspense, while the quick evolutions and swift changes in the position of the combatants effectually prevented a fire that might prove dangerous alike to friend and enemy. But the moment the struggle was decided, a yell arose as fierce and savage as wild and revengeful passions could throw into the air. It was followed by the swift flashes of the rifles which sent their leaden messengers across the rock in volleys, as though the assailants would pour out their impotent fury on the insensible scene of the fatal contest. A steady though deliberate return was made from the rifle of Chingachgook, who had maintained his post throughout the fray with unmoved resolution. When the triumphant shout of Uncas was borne to his ears, the gratified father raised his voice in a single responsive cry, after which his busy piece alone proved that he still guarded his pass with unwearied diligence. In this manner many minutes flew by with the swiftness of thought, the rifles of the assailants speaking, at times in rattling volleys and at others in occasional scattering shots. Though the rock, the trees, and the shrubs were cut and torn in 100 places around the besieged, their cover was so close and so rigidly maintained that as yet David had been the only sufferer in their little band. "Let them burn their powder," said the deliberate scout, while bullet after bullet whizzed by the place where he securely lay. "There will be a fine gathering of lead when it is over, and I fancy the imps will tire of the sport afore these old stones cry out for mercy. Uncas, boy, you waste the kernels by overcharging, and a kicking rifle never carries a true bullet. I told you taking that loping miscreant under the line of white paint. Now, if your bullet went a hair's breadth, it went 2 inches above it. The life now lies low in Mingo, and humanity teaches us to make a quick end of the sarpents." A quiet smile lighted the haughty features of the young Mohican, betraying his knowledge of the English language as well as of others' meanings, but he suffered it to pass away without vindication or reply. "I cannot permit you to accuse Uncas of want of judgment or of skill," said Duncan. "He saved my life in the coolest and readiest manner, and has made a friend who will never require to be reminded of the debt he owes. Uncas partly raised his body and offered his hand to the grasp of Hayward. During this act of friendship, the two young men exchanged looks of intelligence, which caused Duncan to forget the character and condition of his wild associate. In the meanwhile, Hawkeye, who looked on this burst of youthful feeling with a cool but kind regard, made the following reply: "Life is an obligation which friends often owe each other in the wilderness. I dare say I may have served Uncas some such turn myself before now, and I very well remember that he has stood between me and death 5 different times. 3 times from the Mingos, once in crossing Horican, and—" "The bullet was better aimed than common," exclaimed Duncan, involuntarily shrinking from a shot, which struck the rock at his side with a smart rebound. Hawkeye laid his hand on the shapeless metal and shook his head as he examined it, saying, "Falling lead is never flattened. It just comes from the clouds. Had it come from the clouds, this might have happened." But the rifle of Uncas was deliberately raised towards the heavens, directing his companions to a point where the mystery was immediately explained. A ragged oak grew on the right bank of the river, nearly opposite to their position, which, seeking the freedom of open space, had inclined so far forward that its upper branches overhung that arm of the stream which flowed nearest to its own shore. Among the topmost leaves, which scantily concealed the gnarled and stunted limbs, a savage was nestled, partly concealed by the trunk of the tree and partly exposed, as though looking down upon them to ascertain the effect produced by his treacherous aim. "These devils will scale heaven to circumvent us to our ruin," said Hawkeye. "Keep him in play, boy, until I can bring Killdeer to bear, when we will try his mettle on each side of the tree at once." Uncas delayed his rifle fire until the scout uttered the word. The rifles flashed, the leaves and the barks of the oak flew into the air and were scattered by the wind, but the Indian answered their assault by a taunting laugh, sending down upon them another bullet in return that struck the cap of Hawkeye from his head. Once more the savage yells burst out of the woods, and the leaden hail whistled above the heads of the besieged, as if to confine them to a place where they might become easy victims of the enterprise of the warrior who had mounted the tree. "This must be looked to," said the scout, glancing about him with an anxious eye. "Uncas, call up your father. We have need of all our weapons to bring the cunning varmint from his roost." The signal was instantly given, and before Hawkeye had reloaded his rifle, they were joined by Chingachgook. When his son pointed out to the experienced warrior the situation of their dangerous enemy, the usual exclamatory "Huh!" burst from his lips, after which no further expression of surprise or alarm was suffered to escape him. Hawkeye and the Mohicans conversed earnestly together in Delaware for a few moments, when each quietly took his post in order to execute the plan they had speedily devised. The warrior in the oak had maintained a quick, though ineffectual fire from the moment of discovery, but his aim was interrupted by the vigilance of his enemies, whose rifles instantaneously bore on any part of his person that was left exposed. Still his bullets fell in the center of the crouching party. The clothes of Hayward, which rendered him peculiarly conspicuous, were repeatedly cut, and once blood was drawn from a slight wound on his arm. At length, emboldened by the long and patient watchfulness of his enemies, the Huron attempted a better and more fatal aim. The quick eye of the Mohicans caught the dark line of his lower limbs and cautiously exposed through the thin foliage a few inches from the trunk of the tree. Their rifles made a common report when, sinking on his wounded limb, part of the body of the savage came into view. Swift as thought, Hawkeye seized the advantage and discharged his fatal weapon into the top of the oak. The leaves were unusually agitated. The dangerous rifle fell from its commanding elevation, and after a few moments of vain struggling, the form of the savage was seen swinging in the wind, while he still grasped a ragged and naked branch of the tree, with hands clenched in desperation. "Give him, in pity, give him the contents of another rifle," cried Duncan, turning away his eyes in horror from the spectacle of a fellow creature in such awful jeopardy. "Not a carnal!" exclaimed the obdurate Hawkeye. "His death is certain, and we have no powder to spare. For Indian fights sometimes last for days. 'Tis their scalps are ours, and God, who made us, has put into our natures the craving to keep the skin on the head." It has been almost 200 years since the last major ground war in North America. That would be the North American Civil War that was conducted mostly in the American South. The Anglo-French conflicts that broke out in the North American colonies in 1754 were outgrowths of the larger 7 Years' War that was occurring in Europe. And it became a theater, almost a globalization theater, of those battles that were occurring on the European continent between the French, the English, and to a smaller degree, the Spanish and what was then the Prussians, which are now the Germans. These wars and these skirmishes effectively ended France's presence as a global hegemony. And Winston Churchill was right. They were indeed the beginning of a world war. They were what is called by some World War Zero. During that war, a lot of new practices were tried and implemented. A lot of new weapons were brought to the game. And the biggest weapon, of course, was the rifle. By the way, not a smooth bore rifle. So the smooth bore long Kentucky rifle that was carried by Hawkeye, the carbine, such as it were, was not a smooth bore carbine, and so when it would shoot a ball, the ball wouldn't have any backspin on it, and so it had a limited range of motion, but it was further than an arrow and a hell of a lot further than a tomahawk or a knife. And so, just like we read in that piece there, Indians and indigenous people, and of course the European colonial colonists, could engage in warfare using tactics based around this rifle. But the tactics that they were going to be using, and the tactics that they did use, were tactics that were unique to the North American continent. They were guerrilla tactics. See, on the east coast of North America, moving forward across the Allegheny Mountains, moving west across the Allegheny Mountains towards the Great Lakes, that entire area where the French and Indian War was, the majority of the battles of the French and Indian War were fought, going all the way into Quebec and into southern Canada and down into Florida. That area was wild and untrammeled. It was filled with Indians, of course, but it was also filled with forests and creatures and rocky outcroppings. It was not a flat plain like the plains of France or the plains of Germany. It was not an open sea like England experienced with her navy. It was instead a crowded, hidey-hole-ridden environment where people could hide, jump up and shoot you, and then run away, hide, jump up and shoot you again. It was a place that was designed for a new form of warfare, a form of warfare that the American colonists would later turn on the British and use quite effectively in the American Revolutionary War, which would take place around 10 years after the French and Indian Wars were wrapped up. Guerrilla warfare is not something that is unique to the United States of America. It's not something that's unique to our culture as a country. However, it is something that does fit the massive environments that we have here in this country. Even across the Great Plains, where large set battles occurred during the Indian Wars, right, of the 1880s, 1870s, 1890s, and into the 1900s, even there, those battles were small scale in comparison to the great battles on the European plains. And even in World War II, when America went to Europe, it wasn't great battles across the plains of Europe. It wasn't slashing invasions the way Germany moved into Russia. Instead, it was small scale, lightly armored troops moving forward ruthlessly and in cohesion with each other, a summation of the guerrilla tactics that Americans had been using on each other for about 400 years before they returned them to Europe. The Last of the Mohicans, in this way, when we think about guerrilla warfare, has beats of T.E. Lawrence and the Seven Pillars of Wisdom in its description of the land, the natives, and even their motivations to fight. If you decide to fight a guerrilla war, you're fundamentally wired differently than if you try to fight a war in a set battle, or you try to fight a series of set battles in an open plain, right, where phalanxes or where armies can operate at scale. The mentality that you have to win a guerrilla war is the same kind of mentality you have to win a guerrilla war if you're going to fight one in the Arabian desert, where it's hot and dry and ruthless, and you can't really put a whole bunch of people in the middle of a desert. Now, the British Empire at the time of the writing, not the time of the writing, but the time when The Last of the Mohicans is set, during that 7 Years' War, the British Empire handled the 7 Years' War so badly that they had no available allies to help them out 10 years later when the American Revolution kicked off. And the French returned to exact revenge for the destruction of their hegemony in North America. By the way, eventually the French would indeed sell the Louisiana Purchase to the Americans at pennies on the dollar. Thomas Jefferson, that hoary old agrarian president and slave owner, would double the size of the United States without firing a shot in order to help Napoleon, yes, that's right, Napoleon, fully complete his victories, such as it were, during the Napoleonic Wars in Europe. It turns out that the Europeans can't really fight a guerrilla war. It's not really built into their psyche, nor is it built into their conception of warfare, but it is built into the American conception. The Indians fought and used guerrilla tactics against the English in support of the French, and of course, the American Indians used guerrilla tactics against the French in service of the English. By the way, this was a mistake on both their parts. As we noted in episode number 79, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, the Five Nations of the Iroquois, led by Metacom, they understood what was happening to their countries and to their territories on the North American continent, but they didn't put it in a larger geopolitical context. And just like we talked about with Tom Libby on that episode, maybe they really couldn't have put it into a larger geopolitical context. Maybe they wouldn't have understood. But they did understand it in a smaller, more intimate context. And for want of vision, they lost their lands. Now, this is not a knock against the Five Nations of the Iroquois. It is one of the sad tragedies of history and of colonialism. And it is one of the sad facts that sometimes you can use guerrilla tactics in support of a smaller vision that you think is grand and still lose the entire war. So how do we stay on the path using the insights from Last of the Mohicans by James Fenimore Cooper? How do we, as leaders, what is leaders? What do we take from this book, written such a long time ago, and written for a world that was closer to being wild than most of us are in our city-dwelling postmodern time? Well, as leaders, probably the biggest lesson that we should take from The Last of the Mohicans is that it is no crime to be romantic in a cynical age. Look, there's a lot of talk these days about the humanities and about the death of the humanities, and this podcast stands in objection or stands athwart such discussion and yells stop. The humanities used to be all of the stuff that was outside of the mechanistic and the scientific, the stuff that was outside of anything that was ruled by objective natural law, the stuff that made us human. Romanticism stood in stark contrast as it came along just before the Industrial Revolution. It stood in stark, quivering contrast as the last gasp of the humanities, the last gasp of the people of the Enlightenment who had not quite yet thrown off religion, but hadn't quite yet accepted the mechanistic future that was going to lead to abattoirs of death, starting in the Civil War and continuing on until now. Romanticism matters. And I don't mean wild-eyed or doe-eyed, maybe, dismissal of the objective world. After all, we have a podcast here that wouldn't exist without the scientific objective world. But that is not all that there is, and our cynical age says that it is all that there is. Which worldview will you pick? Which one will you build on? Will you be a leader who has a touch of romanticism in him, a touch of what it means to be human? Or will you be a leader that will merely do the mechanical thing, that will look for the utility in the action? The second thing that we can pick up from Last of the Mohicans is this idea of setting the table without eating the dinner. Look, you don't have to be the one that fights, right? You don't have to be the one that goes in and explores. You don't have to be the one that does the work. Sometimes the leader can be the person who sits in the background and who merely waits for others to get their act together. This is what Magua did, and this is also what the Scout did. You don't always have to take action, although it is the motto of this year on this podcast, and it is a better thing to take action than to be passive. Sometimes there is a moment, there is a time for passivity, and timing is everything. The third lesson that we can take from The Last of the Mohicans is that the enemy of my enemy can be leveraged, both against my enemy, but I have to be careful to not leverage that enemy against myself. That's a really, really hard thing to do, as we saw in Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, as we saw in the Seven Pillars of Wisdom, and as now we are seeing in The Last of the Mohicans. Spoiler alert, the 5 Iroquois nations don't make it. Neither does the Scout. And lastly, finally, sometimes guerrilla tactics that are really focused on a small vision with small outcomes aren't what you need in order to succeed as a leader. Sometimes you need a big vision. You need both the clouds and the dirt. And holding both of those together in your head at the same time is a really hard task as a leader. And something that is a task that is worthwhile for us to take on in our era. In our era where we can be pulled down into the dirt of the details so quickly and fight guerrilla wars around things that don't matter, fighting skirmishes around issues that are unimportant, and missing the larger vision of leadership for those who are with us now, who are following us, and those who will follow us in the future. Because there's always a future. And well, that's it for me. Thank you for listening and subscribing to the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast. If you're listening to this on any of the major podcast players, like iTunes, Google Podcasts, or Spotify, please go ahead and leave us a 5-star review and write a little bit in there. A couple of sentences is good enough. That actually helps us game those algorithms that I was just maybe addressing. And, of course, it helps us grow the show. Tell all your family, tell all your friends, and tell the leaders in your life that you know that need to be listening to this show that this show exists. By the way, if you want to get started on the leadership path yourself, or you know some people who need to go on the leadership path, HSCT Publishing, the home company of Leadership Toolbox and Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast, can help you and your team do that. So check out our training webinars, coaching services, and more at leadershiptoolbox.us. We are remote, we're live, we're in person, we're on video, and we've got leadership development solutions for your civic group, nonprofit staff, public sector staff, or even your private sector leaders. And of course, you're going to want to check out our video-based subscription service at leadingkeys.com. That's leadingkeys.com for leadership development on demand. You don't like videos, you don't like training, but you really like the podcast? Well, I would also recommend reading a book. Matter of fact, I'd recommend reading my most recent book, 12 Rules for Leaders, The Foundation of Intentional Leadership. You can get that in paperback, hardcover, or as an ebook on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Kobo, Ingram Spark, and any other place that you order books online. Finally, of course, we're on YouTube just like everybody else is. We'd love to have you help us grow the YouTube channel, so like and subscribe to the video version of this podcast on the HSCT Publishing channel on YouTube. Just search for HSCT Publishing, or you can search for Leadership Toolbox and hit the subscribe button. Subscribing helps us grow the show. As it does with the audio, just is the same with the video. All right, that's it for me.